On November 21st, 2008, Summit Entertainment would release Twilight.
Team Jacob all the way. He's on my shirt. I love him.
A lot of people loved it and a lot of people hated it. But what almost nobody realizes is that we can trace a tangible ripple effect that started with the release of Twilight in 2008 and ended with Donald Trump's eventual first election in 2016 and, of course, by extension, his re-election in 2024.
They said he's the greatest president in history.
Twilight was responsible for a shifting culture and a changing rhetoric that Trump leveraged to win his eventual presidency. So let's dig in. Vampires, love, baseball, what could be bad? An innocent movie, right? And then there's Donald Trump, real estate, The Apprentice, Epstein. Not really all that innocent, is he? Well, Twilight was one of the biggest franchises of the past few decades, and in case you don't remember, it was a cultural explosion.
Crazy and insane, so
Vampires are hot because they bite people. Have my babies, Edward!
From 2008 to 2012, the franchise would release 5 films over 4 years, and its cultural popularity at the time was really only rivaled by Justin Bieber and maybe for a very short time, The Hangover.
Who let the dogs out? Who brought this guy along?
And that's important to realize because things didn't change just because of Twilight, but because of the inescapability of Twilight as well as its cult-like fans. Twilight to date is probably the most successful film franchise marketed primarily to women and girls. So Donald Trump actually has a weird connection to the Twilight franchise over the years. There's that time that he was weirdly passionate about Robert Pattinson and Kristen Stewart's real life relationship.
Now I know what you're thinking, right? That's so crazy. The president tweeted about you once. No. The president tweeted about me 11 times.
11 tweets over a few weeks. I think someone had a little crush on Robert Pattinson. I'm just saying. But overall, Donald Trump should thank this franchise and its cult-like following because it was weird, a little dark with occasionally strange dialogue.
Bella! Where the hell have you been, Loca?
And it had this nerdy kind of... nerdy. Think about that word for a second. Was Twilight a nerdy product? Like, was it built for nerds or was it built for someone different? And who and what counts under the umbrella of nerd? Because if it was 2009 right now and I called Twilight a nerdy product, well, I'd probably be chastised and then called a homophobic slur. Part 2. So I've got to give credit where credit is due. The Unspooled podcast, one of my favorites, recently did an episode where they critiqued and explored the first Twilight movie. And within the episode was a little 2-minute conversation that spawned this whole video. One of the co-hosts, Amy Nicholson, mentioned that her partner had a half-baked theory that Twilight got Donald Trump elected, and one of the things that motivated his thinking was his experience at San Diego Comic-Con shortly after Twilight released. He described this sort of palpable, visceral tension from the traditional Comic-Con attendees and the newfound Twilight attendees. Now, keep in mind, San Diego Comic-Con is the biggest, most culturally significant, quote-unquote nerd event on the planet. And Twilight burst onto the scene, offering a clear divide, a clear anger, and a clear shifting landscape of the event. And thus, by extension, this shifted nerd culture in general. The year that Twilight released was the first year that the entire Comic-Con event sold out entirely in advance. And Rotten Tomatoes has Twilight's 2009 appearance at the San Diego Comic-Con as the biggest and most memorable moment in the history of the event. Why? because that was the year that they were borderline forced to move the presentation of Avatar from before to after the Twilight New Moon presentation, simply because Twilight fans were so rabidly invested in their fandom that their presence would overtake any event preceding it.
So how long is it going to be before you actually get to see the panel?
Well, let's see. 8 tomorrow morning is 24 hours plus 4 more hours, about 28 hours, 30 hours, somewhere in there.
It made participating in other events difficult, and these newcomers built a lot of tension. They helped sell out Comic-Con, but they were there for something that wasn't traditionally associated with the event, and they were everywhere. So Twilight became the catalyst that shifted the convention from a fun event that cultivated seemingly geeky and niche interests and into a pop culture phenomenon that would begin bringing in an array of Hollywood centerpieces. In essence, the money was coming in more than ever for San Diego Comic-Con, but the essence of the event was gone forever.
It's all superhero stuff, right? What if I'm not the hero? What if I'm the bad guy?
And Twilight and its fans took all of the heat. Before long, a movement most popular around 2008 to 2011-ish called Twilight Ruined Comic-Con was born. Traditional fans declared war using Twilight Ruined Comic-Con as their battle cry. In other words, Twilight pissed a lot of people off. It was the reason for SDCC to move away from its comic-focused roots and now cater to massive movie properties that had little to no connection to superheroes or comics. And this was a major complaint from attendees that Twilight, all by itself, initiated Comic-Con's shift away from niche superhero and comic interests and into a pop culture juggernaut. Or did it? Because if this is the complaint, does it really have merit? And I'm really asking because 2008 was also the year that the Marvel Cinematic Universe would launch, marking unprecedented change for superheroes and comic properties. In other words, marking the moment that superheroes would become the staple of the most profitable and arguably the most mainstream film franchise on the planet.
A hostile alien army came charging through a hole in space.
Sure, it gets a pass because of its comic roots, but it is a notable shift from niche interest to pop culture phenomenon.
We're the Avengers. We can bust arms dealers all the livelong day, but that up there, that's the end game.
And even then, what about Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, Avatar, or even Halo? None of these has a connection to comics or superheroes in the traditional sense. And especially in the case of Lord of the Rings and Star Wars, they are also pop culture staples that couldn't be further from having a niche fandom, but each has a persistent connection to what we may think of as traditionally nerdy. And I think that's the difference. But I mean, where does that actually come from? Like, when you hear about Lord of the Rings or Star Wars, you probably think of them as nerdy type of products, but you likely don't think of Twilight that way. And why? Who decides that? It's an interesting question because what makes this subculture accept and reject properties?
Truth is,
but let's keep going. If those properties are still nerdy enough, what about shows like Lost, True Blood, or Game of Thrones that would crop up at Comic-Con during the Twilight era? Movies like The Grudge, Saw, Snakes on a Plane, Final Destination, these all ended up at Comic-Con pre-Twilight. Even Superbad was there before Twilight was. And I fucking love Superbad, but can we really say that Superbad is more nerdy than Twilight? No, probably not, right? In any event, the appearance of these things are a very steep shift from Comic-Con's apparent roots, and contradict or at least weaken the argument that Twilight ruined Comic-Con by moving away from those roots. Yet, these properties received very little backlash for their presence. So, what did Twilight really ruin? Twilight is a little supernatural, mythical, fantastical. It has beings with what are ostensibly superpowers.
As if you could outrun me!
As if you could fight me off. I'm designed to kill.
So, it's at worst par for the course. It has literary roots, not comic roots, but literary roots, just like some of the properties I just mentioned. So then, if that's all seemingly the same, what's the difference? Well, you know the difference. Okay, so traditionally nerdy spaces have always been primarily male-dominated, and just in case there are doubts out there, here are some studies that back it up. And this primarily male presence also includes the premier nerdy event, Comic-Con. And what better to unlock your insecurities than a bunch of girls screaming for handsome dudes that aren't you, am I right? No, I mean, the real answer is, to simplify, a popularity so strong that it actually impacts the event. Like, just for example, High School Musical also showed up at Comic-Con in 2008 and did so just a day after Twilight. But there was no subsequent movement against that. So the real answer is probably somewhere around the fact that it was overwhelmingly young adult/teen audiences full of women and girls, and it was insanely popular to the point that it prevented traditional Comic-Con attendees from participating in what they wanted to, along with the fact that most traditional attendees had no interest in the Twilight product. And this is in many ways because it's not a masculine product, whereas Star Wars or Lord of the Rings cater to typical male interests. Also, I'll throw into the hat that there could have been some growing disdain for Comic-Con's preceding move away from comic roots and superheroes, but it was kept at bay because there was still enough of a focus on superheroes and comics, or the attendees still had some interest in things like horror or a show like True Blood, which, by the way, was also a vampire adaptation, but it was more sexual and gory. It wasn't for primarily, young girls or young adult women, right? So in this era, not only did a whole new, less traditional fan base show up in big numbers, but traditional attendees didn't want it there, and it overran the space, thus threatening an existing culture. A major part of that was the strong influx of women and girls into a traditionally male space, on top of a growing anxiety that nerd culture might just change. Also, just to get this out of the way real quick, I would really like to acknowledge that not every person attending Comic-Con felt this way, nor am I trying to put every attendee in a box by any means, but in general, I'm referring to a significant amount of attendees in this era that were very vocal during this time. Thank you. Whew. Okay. So, it wasn't long before this Twilight hatred found its way to the wild west of the internet back in the ancient times of 2008 to 2012. I'd like to remind everyone that smartphones were just kind of becoming a thing at this time, and probably by like 2014-ish, most people had fully made the transition from a dedicated computer room to the internet following you around in your pocket. And it was a fast transition where nobody had a smartphone in like 2009, and then everyone had one in like 2014. So picture that landscape. It's 2009. Most people in developed countries are online, but it's mostly confined to probably Facebook at this time, and you had to physically go and log on with intention. Facebook was still a cool hangout that your parents didn't really know how to use.
So is it going live? Right now?
But beyond participating in Facebook or consuming via Google or YouTube, participating in forums or Reddit, 4chan, 9gag, Funny Junk, doing so was still a very niche, geeky, and quite intentional thing to be doing. Nowadays, we see Reddit as a mainstream news aggregate that follows you around and you can log on anytime. And as for those other sites, well, they're still pretty nerdy, to be honest, and some of them are downright awful. Anyways, these places were a great place for people in nerdy communities, primarily men, to share a growing concern and a growing disdain for Twilight and its female fan base, as well as Twilight's position as a caterer to a female market. And naturally, this is where plenty of Comic-Con attendees would gather online. And more importantly, because this is going to come back later, they were able to spread their point of view anonymously. For the first time in human history, we're 10 to 15 years into the internet at this point, we had a place where threatened or envious young men could go and displace their emotions and spread an ill point of view, at least in a way that could be massively shared, scaled, and reinforced. And honestly, I think some anxiety over what was happening is understandable, and that's not to say that some people didn't handle it maturely, and I'm not saying the response is warranted either, but you can see how a changing or shifting landscape or community could be jarring or even scary. However, people often do not know how to deal with their emotions. And it started with Comic-Con and some concerns over a shifting landscape, but pretty quickly it just became a mess of displaced misogyny and homophobia. I think there's a very real jealousy there, where a lot of female fans of Twilight are also head over heels for the cast.
I just want to ask how it is to portray a super hot vampire in the movie.
And so naturally, it feels good to take down the thing that hurts you and makes you feel insecure and is perceived as a threat in multiple ways. But in this era, that just meant that the massive influx of women into a nerdy space became an easy target, and Twilight became the gayest and most feminine thing, and therefore the most awful thing on the planet. Just for the youth out there, back then it was very normal to use gay or feminine as an insult for anything bad, especially in male spaces. Being gay or feminine was like the worst thing you could be back then, and yeah, this was misogynistic and homophobic as fuck, and we all suck for being there. But anyways, as this anger brewed, it taught and reinforced that being gay or feminine was not allowed. And for those in nerdy spaces, it taught that women were subhuman, their interests were dumb, and that they needed to be kept out. Twilight's encroachment increased the acceptability of misogyny and homophobia in online spaces, while also demonstrating how and what is appropriate in these spaces. People in these communities were actively learning to exclude anything feminine, and to do so by using insults as a form of social exclusion. And just to be clear, these attitudes already existed among most primarily masculine communities, but this was a period where it was getting worse because there was a reason for it to get worse. It was an era where meme culture peaked and you could say whatever you wanted anonymously, and these spaces skewed younger. And so young people could form belief systems around these attitudes and then spread it even further. Okay, so I'm sitting here editing this, and I have something to add to this part of the video. So I think that in my original recording, I really underrated the influx of women into internet spaces as well. Twilight fans were also very online and in growing numbers, especially as internet participation, which was previously a relatively nerdy thing, was becoming a mainstream thing thanks to the advent of Facebook and YouTube. This was a big time explosion at the time. And so there was now an influx of young women and girls into online spaces that wanted to talk about this major cultural thing that they really liked, but it also happened to be something that was already ruining another nerdy thing. So there's multiple avenues where nerd culture is kind of shifting and even being threatened to be lost forever. With the internet and Comic-Con seeing massive mainstream influx in combination with existing male-dominant belief systems about what nerd culture is, you get scared people who are afraid to lose their sense of belonging. I mean, you really do have to keep in mind that nerdy culture is often representative of people who feel shunned by mainstream society. And so you could see how that would make hatred, as vile or horrible and as wrong as it was and is, a perceived way of protecting your internet space from this influx of mainstream fandom. And, you know, going back to Comic-Con, where a good chunk of attendees hated the Twilight fans because of how they behaved, the internet was just kind of a no-holds-barred place for those attitudes to go even crazier on both sides. Because there's a newness to coexisting with others online and with some overlap, or at least the potential for overlap or encroachment. And I think someone who listens to this probably can speak on this better, but I would guess that algorithms of the time were not as strong at showing you your interests as they are now. Like, they don't cater your interests back then as much as they do now. And so you'd see a lot of shit that you probably didn't want to see, and I could see that contributing to culture wars, right? And anyways, point is that the nerdy internet was threatened by all sorts of mainstream influx, not just Twilight, although it was a major contributor, but people in specific internet spaces really wanted to push back against this. And maybe it starts with complaints or dismissing Twilight fans as not real fans, or you know, seeing them as people who don't belong. And then it devolves into misogyny and homophobia, or rather something that aligns with the existing dominant attitudes in male spaces of the time, and it heightens them. It takes them and manifests them into just awful, horrible language. I hope that makes sense. Like, you have an established, primarily male status quo that only accepts certain interests and people. It's then threatened by mainstream influx, and this increases negative attitudes. Okay. And also, if you see this and this, I hit my head off of a cabinet since recording. And also, check out my shirt. My girlfriend had one. Okay, bye. And you know, it's hard to know how big of a target Twilight would be without Comic-Con, and even how bad misogyny would still be in these spaces if Twilight wasn't ever a thing. Like, I'm not sitting here and saying that Twilight is the sole culprit, or that it wasn't already cool to exclude women from nerd spaces or nerdy online communities. I'm saying that a pop culture phenomenon, one of the biggest film properties in the Western world, inadvertently shifted / heightened / exacerbated attitudes on a massive scale and for an extended period, a number of years. If you were trying to point to one thing that really heightened these attitudes around this time, I would say that it's displaced anger toward Twilight, or even Justin Bieber. Justin Bieber got a similar level of hate and was primarily mocked for being gay or being feminine, which I would actually also argue that the Twilight era primed people to speak that way, and Justin Bieber caught the same flack shortly after, because he rose to fame just as Twilight was getting obliterated for being feminine and for being gay, and he kind of became the next thing that was like, oh, there's another guy that young girls think is, you know, super attractive, and that makes me insecure. So I better call that thing gay and feminine on the internet, just like I did with this other thing, because that's just the same shit we've been doing. You know? I hope that makes sense. Check out this retrospective on the Twilight era. It was written by Marianne Alois and was posted on RogerEbert.com in 2018. Huge franchises like Star Wars or The Avengers, which are also designed mostly for male teens, are perfectly acceptable media for adults to consume and pick apart critically. But when a new Marvel film is released, even when it is poorly reviewed, there is nothing near the level of public takedown that Twilight attracted. Mediocre, even bad films for men and boys are allowed to be enjoyed as disposable entertainment, or at least fade into obscurity. That isn't to say either that we can't say we don't like films aimed at women and girls, but we need to think of a few things first. Why do we hate it? Because other people love it? because its content is twee or romantic or campy or anything else associated with young women. Were this a film aimed at men but similarly poorly written with campy acting, would we feel so much hate? It isn't that people hated Twilight, it's the gendered nature and language of that hatred. So what do we have so far? We have Twilight, we have women in nerd spaces, we have a push to keep women out of nerd spaces, we have growing misogyny and homophobia in nerd spaces. Okay, yeah. Wait, where the fuck does Trump come in? Well, trust me, he's gonna show up soon. But first, we gotta talk about a truly dark event in human history, recent history, because all of this was leading to this moment. If you're familiar with Gamergate, you can probably already see how this onslaught toward Twilight was something of a primer for this moment, a kind of cultural precursor, if you will. If you're not familiar with Gamergate, it was a pseudo-movement that saw traditionally white, heterosexual, male gaming communities as being encroached upon by women and other minorities. In fact, it declared that feminism and diversity were a threat to something, and took aim at women working in the video game industry. Gamergaters believe that gaming was dead or dying in large part because of women participating in the gaming industry, as well as a growing number of games being made that were oriented away from heterosexual white dudes. Remind you of anything? The Gamergate era started in the middle of 2014, so just a year or two after the Twilight fun had died down. And the start of Gamergate was an accusation against Zoe Quinn on behalf of Aaron Joni, a programmer who had a relationship with Zoe Quinn. They had a bad breakup, and Aaron Joni made a lengthy blog post from his perspective. The main part to know is that Joni made an implication, not an explicit statement, but an implication that Quinn exchanged sex with Nathan Grayson for a positive review of the game that Quinn made, Depression Quest. However, not only did Grayson never actually review the game, but he only ever mentioned Zoe Quinn once, and this was before they ever had a relationship. Just a quick addendum here. It is debated online whether or not an ethical breach actually did occur. For example, one Redditor on a post called "Let's Talk About Nathan Grayson's Ethical Breach" cites multiple articles that apparently do demonstrate an ethical breach, whereas other Redditors, Wikipedia, and even Kotaku claim no ethical violations. And I'm not deep diving into that here, and if you want to stake your claim as to whether a violation did occur, I will read it in the comments, but in my case, I align with this particular Redditor who makes the very good point of if the question should be if an ethical violation occurred or if the backlash itself was warranted if an ethical violation occurred. Either way, the blog post ended up on 4chan, Reddit, and other places, and in those communities it set off plenty of misogyny-fueled outrage. Essentially, because this was a woman who, by the way, no longer identifies as a woman, but did at this time, in a nerdy space, who had apparently done something slightly wrong, they became a prime target for extreme harassment. And I'm talking horrifying and graphic threats, doxing, and things mailed to Quinn's address. It was a strange trigger in these nerdy communities, because a person perceived as a woman in a nerdy community steps slightly out of line, so people line up in droves to attack them. And it began with arguing that ethics in journalism needed to be upheld, which people then stretched into seeing that Quinn's stance as a feminist, as well as Quinn's game Depression Quest, was a violation of traditional gaming etiquette. Because the game got criticism from some parts of these communities for departing from a traditional action-packed type of format, and also for having themes that concern mental health. And the suggestion was that the sex for a review situation was a way of forcing a social justice perspective onto the gaming community. I don't know. I don't pretend to understand Gamergaters, but I don't know. It's all weird to me, because The extreme entitlement and the echo chamber you need to live in to think that extreme harassment as a form of social exclusion is okay and is helping your community is insane, and this doesn't happen overnight. You need precursors like the massive Twilight hatred and a social circle that has learned and continues to see women as subhuman and condones or even applauds this heinous type of behavior. And views that disparaged the existence of women had been shared for years in those same communities, 4chan, certain parts of Reddit, etc. I mean, women couldn't even enter a COD lobby at this time and talk without being eviscerated. So there's layers to it. It all led here. It's the same anxiety that caused the Twilight hate to be displaced onto women, and that's the fear of change within a community. Anyways, any guise of ethical concerns were abandoned as women were targeted in the same way that Quinn was. Many women left the gaming industry as a result, and remember, I mentioned anonymity that would come back later. That's a major part of this. Anonymity allowed most of those involved to spread their messages or target these women with little to no consequence. Obviously, we're talking about explicitly illegal actions in the Gamergate situation versus just some pretty awful language on the internet in the case of Twilight, but there are parallels there where anonymity gave people a weird sense of freedom and allowed an easier spread of ideology. I can't help but think of a few things, really. First, despite Joni saying that he had no evidence and the claim being easily disproven, the backlash continued. But let's say that everything was true. Would it have gotten the same attention if it were a straight white man that was written about? Abso-fucking-lutely not. Second, as I mentioned, there was an existing and established narrow point of view in traditional nerd spaces. Because of the internet, we witnessed two different events that resulted in an unrelenting onslaught against women and, to maybe a lesser degree, toward queer people. The advent of Twilight primed traditional nerd communities for accepting misogyny and taught younger participants to push back against women in nerd spaces, and heightened general existing misogyny and social exclusion. People understood that if something occurs that significantly threatens the traditional heterosexual male nerdcore audience, no holds barred backlash is warranted. And then Gamergate was just those attitudes being multiplied or amplified even more. But what is most interesting is that in the case of Twilight and Gamergate, where there was a supposed reason for pushback, which is a changing nerdy landscape, it just became an excuse for unrelenting misogyny both times. Communities lost sight of their original concerns. Gamergate was the most extreme example, but both are onslaughts that started with concerns that, you know, I'm not saying they're legitimate concerns, but there was a reason that could be pointed to, and then it just moved into vile language, behavior, and bullying that many in the community were participating in without even knowing why. So if you're keeping track, we're sitting around 2015 in the timeline at this point, and Gamergate was at its peak from 2014 to 2015-ish. And in June of 2015, Donald Trump would announce his presidential campaign.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am officially running for President of the United States.
Also in 2015, we're at a time where becoming an online influencer is an increasingly popular career option. The internet is fully our world at this point. It's with you 24/7, and being an internet personality is a very legitimate moneymaker, whereas in 2008, it wasn't seen really as a viable option, at least not really. Like, it happened, but it wasn't as normalized. And during Gamergate, there were dozens of influencers who brought in massive audiences thanks to simply just talking and supporting Gamergate publicly. And this really contributed to not just an anti-social justice perspective among nerdy communities, but also a right-wing perspective, because influencers associated with Gamergate were also typically explicit proponents of right-wing politics. The two people that I want to talk about are Milo Yiannopoulos, who is well known to have risen to popularity by championing the Gamergate movement publicly, and really was the primary face of Gamergate, And then there's a guy named Steve Bannon. Who the fuck is that? Well, he's not an influencer, at least not in the way we think of them, but he seemed to see the political power that online influence held. And this isn't conjecture in any way. He literally said this: you can activate that army, they come in through Gamergate or whatever, and then get turned onto politics and Trump. And what he's referring to is flooding the zone, which means to funnel a certain community to certain places to increase their existing views, essentially, or help grow passion for a subject. And as Gamergate taught those in certain communities to be in opposition to political correctness, feminism, etc., and was a highly emotional and passionate time for those involved, it made sense to capitalize on these views and help make them right-wing, or rather, Trump supporters. Steve Bannon was the executive chairman of Breitbart News, a place where the newfound face of Gamergate, Milo Yiannopoulos, was a senior editor. So it was a simple point A to point B situation. People were interested in Yiannopoulos through Gamergate. He even popularized the hashtag on the Breitbart News website. And then people went to a place that he was most associated with and where he would write about his politics, and then they read or consumed his content as well as other right-wing content. And around this time, they even secured exclusive interviews with Donald Trump, increasing the support for a right-wing president even more. Eventually, 88 days before Trump would be elected, Steve Bannon was hired as the chief executive of Trump's 2016 presidential campaign, and then the chief White House strategist and senior counselor in 2017. He was fired and eventually went back to Breitbart News and then stepped down from that in like 2018 or something. I don't know. And then, of course, we got Donald Trump as president. I mean, not me, because I'm Canadian, thankfully, but it still affects me and other people, and it sucks ass, but, you know. I honestly think that one of the smartest things that the Trump campaign did after all of this was come up with the Make America Great Again campaign slogan.
We need somebody that literally will take this country and make it great again.
Because it harkens back to a false idea that the 50s were a perfect time to be alive. And this is the same thing that Ronald Reagan did. And that outlook is because of media censorship at the time. But also for these people we talked about in this video, these some of which are newfound right-wingers, it reminds them of a time where women had very little say and really couldn't participate in any sort of male community at all. And so, I don't know, it was kind of a stroke of genius on whoever came up with that, but the outcome sucks ass. I mean, Donald Trump sucks, homophobia sucks, misogyny sucks, etc. Either way, thank you so much for watching. I do want to say it's really cool that people are checking out some of these videos. If you do have questions, comments, concerns about this one, please do feel free to comment. Unless you're like super angry. If you're really angry, I'll probably just ignore you for the most part. If this video does get any sort of traction at all, I mean, I expect a good flow of hate comments, but I don't know. I'm going to say it again. Gamergate sucks. Trump sucks. So, yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time. Bye.